When a routine traffic stop unexpectedly becomes a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never saw coming. His target? A man holding his future in his hands. As the sun began its descent over Sacramento's streets, it painted the sky in hues of gold and amber. Eric Porter was headed home after a long day at the office. His sedan hummed softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to shed the day's stress. The faint sound of the radio played in the background, a soothing balm to the hectic city atmosphere. Approaching a yellow light, Eric slowed, just in time for it to turn red. That's when the blue and red lights flared behind him, followed by the sharp blare of a police siren. Glancing into his rearview mirror, Eric furrowed his brow. He pulled over, rolling down his window as the police cruiser stopped behind him. Out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s, sporting a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest. Adjusting his belt, Larson swaggered toward Eric's car, exuding the confidence of someone who was accustomed to being in control. "License and registration," Larson ordered curtly, his voice flat yet carrying a hint of authority. Eric complied without hesitation, retrieving his registration and handing over his driver's license. His movements were deliberate, calm, but he could feel Larson's gaze scanning him, looking for any excuse to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning closer to the window. "Not entirely sure," Eric replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson said, though there was a brief hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned slightly, nodding. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't respond right away. Instead, he lingered, his gaze narrowing as he studied Eric more intently. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore, at least not for Larson. His posture subtly shifted, as if he'd already decided this was more than just a minor infraction. Looking at the license in his hand, Larson asked, "You're not from around here, are you?" Eric hesitated for a moment before replying, "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't really listening. His questions were taking on a sharper edge, revealing that he wasn't concerned with the traffic violation anymore. Eric's composed demeanor seemed to provoke him, and he leaned in closer. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson asked. "Just going home," Eric replied, his tone still steady, but the shift in the air was palpable. Larson didn't see Eric as just a driver anymore. There was something else, something that made him suspicious. Eric felt the tension, but he didn't flinch. Little did Larson know, that calm exterior wasn't naivety, it was control. This was just the beginning. Larson took a step back, folding Eric's documents slowly before tucking them into his chest pocket. Straightening up, his expression shifted into something faintly smug, as if he'd already made up his mind about the man in front of him. "Step out of the car for me," Larson ordered. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face showed no reaction. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone measured. Larson's lips twitched, but he quickly masked it. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The unspoken threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Eric exhaled slowly and opened the door. As he stepped out, Larson's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up. Eric stood a little taller than the officer, his shoulders broad, but his demeanor remained unthreatening. His tailored suit suggested professionalism. His polished shoes hinted at someone meticulous and careful. Yet none of that seemed to matter. "Hands where I can see them," Larson ordered, gesturing toward the front of the car. Eric complied, his movements calm and deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Larson smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Larson. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed with a punch. For a moment, Larson's composure faltered. He straightened up, his hand drifting toward his belt, a reflex more than a necessity. "Watch your tone," he snapped, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question," Eric replied, his voice firm but calm. There was no defiance, just an unsettling firmness that seemed to unsettle Larson. Larson leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. Got something to hide?" Eric allowed the silence to stretch for a beat before answering. "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know?" Larson scoffed but didn't reply. He stepped back, pacing a small circle in front of the car. The dynamic had shifted in ways he couldn't quite grasp. Eric wasn't reacting the way most people would. There was no fear, no stammering, no nervous fidgeting. Instead, there was control, poise, and an unsettling calm that put Larson on edge. Eric didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and replied, "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Larson froze for a brief moment, before turning back to face him. The smugness vanished, replaced by something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words never came. Eric's unshakable composure was throwing him off balance, and he didn't like it. As the silence lingered, the tension between them crackled with electricity. Larson could feel it now. This wasn't going to go as he had expected. But instead of backing down, he decided to double down. The real test was about to begin. Frustration barely concealed, Larson tapped his fingers against his holster. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Eric. His gaze flickered back to the sedan, as though searching for a justification he hadn't yet created. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Larson ordered, his voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" He repeated, incredulous, but still measured. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw tightened. For a moment, his composure cracked. "I'm not going to ask you again." Eric hesitated for a brief moment, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of the car. Larson approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt breaking the uneasy silence. The officer pat-down was quick and rough, his hands lingering a bit longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search, it was an attempt to assert dominance, to provoke a reaction. But Eric didn't flinch. He didn't stiffen. He didn't even so much as shift under the invasive scrutiny. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back. The admission sounded begrudging, as though he was irritated that he hadn't found anything to back up his suspicions. Eric turned to face him, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done." Larson interrupted, his voice rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to remain in control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric folded his arms, his posture relaxed despite the crackling tension. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "So, you a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled faintly. "Or something." The ambiguity in Eric's response only seemed to irritate Larson further. He stepped closer, invading Eric's personal space, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? You think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric met his gaze evenly, unflinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Larson took the bait. "Fairness?" Larson scoffed. "You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always." He stopped abruptly, the words lingering in the air like smoke, even though they hadn't fully escaped. Eric's expression didn't change, but something about his posture shifted, a subtle yet unmistakable signal that he'd caught exactly what Larson had left unsaid. "People like me?" Eric repeated softly, but with charge in his voice. Larson bristled, stepping back, realizing he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. "I think I do," Eric replied quietly, his calmness no longer passive. It was razor-sharp, cutting through the pretense like a blade. "And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Larson opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he looked uncertain, unsure of how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and Larson was on shaky ground for the first time. But the moment of reckoning was still ahead, and it would be one Larson would never forget. Eric's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows knitted, his irritation resurfacing. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though the faint crack in his tone suggested otherwise. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Larson's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." "Eric Porter," Eric said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larson froze. His eyes darted from the badge to Eric's face, searching for a sign that this was some kind of joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only quiet authority and a hint of disappointment. Internal affairs? Larson repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Your? Yes, Eric interrupted, saving him the trouble of finishing the thought. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent. Larson's face drained of color, his confident demeanor unraveling in real time. He took a small step back, his hand falling away from his belt, as though the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too heavy. Eric took a step forward, closing the gap Larson had instinctively created. Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson? He asked, his voice calm but piercing. Larson didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd walked into quicksand and had no idea how to escape. It's not the profiling, Eric continued, though that was bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. You assumed that I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why? Larson opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eric's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. Because. Eric finished the thought for him, his words soft but heavy with meaning. I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect. Eric's words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of an indictment. And that's not just a problem for me, officer, he continued, his voice steady. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform. Larson's shoulders sagged slightly, the full weight of Eric's words landing squarely on him. He glanced down at the badge in Eric's hand again, as if it might somehow disappear if he didn't look too closely. Eric stepped back, giving Larson a moment to breathe, but his voice didn't lose its edge. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next. Larson's lips parted, but he hesitated, clearly debating whether to push back or comply. The hesitation cost him. Eric added, his voice lowering slightly, You're going to hear from me again. Not as the driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge. Larson swallowed hard, his face reddening as the weight of the moment sank in. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Eric's license and registration, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them over. Eric took them without a word, tucking them into his wallet. He stepped toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing with one hand on the handle. Looking over his shoulder, he met Larson's gaze one last time. Remember this, Officer Larson, Eric said. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone. As Eric slid back into his car and started the engine, Larson was left standing in the fading light. His confidence had been shattered, and his future uncertain. But for Eric, this was far from over. His next move would ripple through the entire department. The drive home was quiet, but Eric's mind was anything but. The encounter played over in his head, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had dealt with in this way, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, Eric had the authority to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, the early sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file sat open in front of him, Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. There were minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. As he thought about the broader implications, Larson wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom of a deeper problem. Eric wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in, holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in Eric's tone. "Of course," she said before slipping out of the room. Eric turned his attention back to Larson's file, but his focus wasn't just on the officer. This was bigger than one man and one interaction. It was about the culture that allowed someone like Larson to feel justified in his behavior. And if there was one thing Eric knew, it was that culture started at the top. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Eric replied. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels looked at him, the weight of the conversation etched into his face. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked tirelessly compiling data, speaking with officers, and holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Eric made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Larson during the proceedings and watching as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Larson. It was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and local residents. He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. His words weren't just a call for accountability. They were a promise of change. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building here together." The applause was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As Eric stepped down from the podium, he glanced at the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. He knew change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough.